Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we're going to show you how to take information from a second activity and pass it back to the first activity or the parent activity. Now, in our previous video, I showed you how to pass it from the parent, this first one here, and pass it to the second one. So be sure to watch that, or just copy down the code as you see, because we're going to use this as our base for this application that we're going to build out today. So let's get started. Now, to receive a result from our second activity, what we need to do is start activity for result. So I'm going to change our start activity line here, and I'm going to simply hit the control space key to bring up our autocomplete. And then we can see that all the different start activities. The next thing I want to do is type in FOR for 4, and that'll bring up our start activity for result options here that we can select. And so I'm just going to select that first one. And the only difference between this version and the version we were just using is it's going to ask us for a request code. This request code is going to let us know who was the calling parent activity that we can then, when we get reference from or the result from, it'll let us know. It's kind of the ID number for who's calling this. So what I'm going to do is just type in, let's type in a nice number, let's say 12, and we'll use this here later. Now, when our second activity passes back the result, we need to catch that in this first activity. So we're in our main activity Kotlin file here, and I'm going to go down outside of our button listener or click listener, and I'm going to hit the Command N or Control N on Windows. And if you go down to override methods, or as you can see, if I hit Control O, this brings up the same thing. But I also wanted to show you that we have other functions that we can bring up here and utilize in this menu. So anyway, Control O will bring that up. This will bring up a window that we can have a list of all of our overrides. If you just type in result and then hit down until you see onActivityResult, it should just be 1, or you can type in onActivityResult and then hit enter. That'll generate our function header here. So onActivityResult, it'll pass in a result code, a request code, and then the result code, and then finally the data. Now that request code is going to be this one if we have multiple start activities from results from, say, other activities, or we want to be specific about where in the code this was called. That's where that ID is used. And then the result code is going to let us know whether that result was a successful result or not, or the user canceled, etc. Our data here is going to be what we're actually interested in receiving back. All right, before we get the data out of our data object here, I am going to go to our second activity, which, if you remember, we called person display activity. And this pulls out information from our first intent and puts it into some variables and then displays that on the screen. So we want to pass back some information whether it was successful or not. And I'm not going to do a whole lot of calculations here, but what I am going to do is, if we expand this out, and I'm going to go down to our layout folder here so that I can actually get our layout for our person display here. Now, if you remember in the last video, it's just 3 text views, but I'm going to add 2 buttons. One's going to be a OK button or a save button, and then the other one's going to be a cancel button. I don't really care about the design right now, but I'm just going to hit save. And then for this one, let's say cancel. Again, I'm not too concerned with the design, but I will move that save button up here. Give it an ID, call save underscore button, and then cancel underscore button. All right, and so we have all that set up now in our person display activity. I'm going to set up the click listeners for that. So we're just going to have our save button of type button, and that's going to get found by our find view by ID. And of course, I didn't enter in the import the library here, so option enter will import that for me, and I can get rid of this template entry there. And then find view by ID, we're going to do r.id and then save button in this case. And then we're also going to have one for the cancel button, if you remember from our previous videos. And then again, find view by ID, r.id, and then cancel button. Make sure you choose the right one. Okay, so when we hit that save button, let's say that these text views are edit text and we can edit the information and then pass it back to our first view. We're not going to do that, but what we are going to do is programmatically change it so that you can see the differences in our first activity. So once we have our save button reference, we can call save button. So we use set on click listener, and we're going to use the second option here. And inside of our Lambda, our block of code, what we're going to do is on our activity, we're going to call set result. Okay, and so you can see two different options here. We can set result. Let's just show you the first one really quickly. And the result for this, if I just type in all capitalized result, you can see that we have three options here. We have result canceled. So if the user wants to cancel the action, that first activity will know that nothing happened in that second activity, and therefore you don't need to do anything with the data. And then we also have result OK, which means that, yes, we probably did affect that data. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. We also have first result first user. Now this is for custom results that come back, and you can look up the declarations for that if you're more curious on that one. But usually we're only going to use result cancel and result OK. So because we're the save button, we're going to use result OK. And this will allow us to let the first activity know that, yep, this was okay, but we haven't really done anything yet. So the first thing I'm going to do before programmatically changing our data is I'm going to call finish. And what that's going to do is it's going to finish our second activity, and it's going to pop that off the stack and return to our previous activity, which is just our first activity in this case. So we're going to call finish, and I'm going to actually copy this code and paste it, and I'm going to change it for our cancel button, because our cancel button is essentially what we're going to, that's all we're going to do for our cancel button is just set the result. But of course we're going to set it to canceled, and then we're going to finish it. So nothing done when we cancel it, but when we save it, we do want to take this person object that we have here, and whatever values that are in it, we're just going to change the first name. And then finally, we're going to do this for our last name. Okay, and so again, you might be changing these values via edit texts instead of these text views. You would just swap these out. All right, so if you remember our person object, the first name and last name, we decided that we were not going to change that. As you can see here, everything except for our age, which of course changes, is a value, so that doesn't change. But if I go here and I say, well, I really do want to change this, I do understand that first name and last name can be mutable, I can click on here, and anywhere in the squiggly line that is, and I'm going to click on this red light bulb and make that mutable. Now that'll fix this error for first name. If I go back to person, you can now see that our first name has been changed to a variable. Now if you don't want to do that, if you do want to say value, go back here. What's probably best is we create a new person. So I'm going to create new person here of type person, and let's set that equal to all these. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that and how that works. And this is pretty easy just to throw this into the constructor. We'll change the age to 10. I did forget the birthday, but this is a great opportunity to introduce you to defaults. So let's say I didn't want to enter a birthday in. I can just set this equal to date, and that'll set a default to whatever this value is. I can put in a particular day, and that'll set it to this object if I'm not entering anything in this case. So let's go back to our person, and that'll fix that error. So that's just another way to handle your data classes, which is in a previous video that we created. All right, so once we have this new person, we set results, we still haven't done anything. So what we really need to do is wrap this into an intent that we then pass back to our first activity. So what I'm going to do is create a new intent. Let's call it return intent. Be a little bit more explicit about it, of type intent. And we're going to set that equal to a intent constructor, just like that. And then just like when we created our intent on our first activity, in our second activity, we do the same thing to package in content. So we can put an extra in here. Let's put that person. So we're actually going to put a serializable of type, let's call it return underscore person. Of course, again, you would put this into some constant. You wouldn't put it as a string literal. And then we're going to pass in that new person, which of course is a serializable object if you didn't watch the previous video. So again, serializable will allow us to pass it back and forth. Okay, we'll go back to our person activity. And now that we have this intent that we've created with some bundled information, we can also pack in some other information like an integer, something like that. And then of course, let's put in some good number like 55. All right, so again, we have this intent, we've wrapped some information into it, but we need to pass it back to that first activity. And we do that with the set result. Now this set result is just passing back the fact whether it was a success or a cancel. So again, if I hit the cancel button, result would be canceled. If it's the save button, the result will be okay. And then if you remember in our main activity on this function that gets called back, we have our result code. So our result code is going to be something like if result code equals result okay. Do something with the data, else ignore and do something else. Okay. So let's go ahead and pass that information back. Again, this is a overloaded method, which just means we can have other parameters in here, and we're going to pass in that return intent. All right, so what I'm going to do is put a breakpoint here by clicking in this gutter, and then I'm going to stop our execution from our last version to stop our simulator so we can debug it. And let's go back to our first activity because we're going to do something with this data. So if you remember with our data classes, person being a data class and having this constructor here, we're able to automatically have a person toString method created for us, but we first have to get that person. So let's get that person, let's call it returned person, and that's of type person, of course. We're going to set that equal to our data, and again, you can see that this is an intent. Now this data is nullable. So if you look at that question mark, it could possibly come in as null if we just called, if I go back to that function, if I did not pass back this intent, that intent would be null in the result. So we're going to first make sure that our data is not null. Wrap everything. I'm going to highlight it, hit the tab key to indent it, and then create our end curly brace here. And then once we know our data is not null, we can simply do data dot and then get serializable extra. And again, that's very similar to the way that we get that out of our second activity. So if you remember from our second activity, we use pretty much the same function here. So putting intents, whether it's going from our first activity to our second activity or from our second activity to our first activity, this works very much the same way, which is really nice. And again, I should not put the string constants in here because I forget what the value is, but this is going to be out of the key here. So we're going to get this serializable person out, and then I got to typecast this as a person object when it comes back. And again, we know that data is not null. Now here's a cool thing. If I highlight this and I hit the Command Shift up button a couple times and move it out of this data null check, now it's saying that data here, it's a compiler error, and it's saying that data is not null checked. I haven't null checked it yet. And so what I have to do is I have to explicitly add in a question mark here to make sure that it's not null. So if I click on that little squiggly, you can see that this red light bulb comes up, and I can say, yeah, replace it with a safe question mark here. But again, that onus goes on to me as a developer to make sure that that data comes back as not null. And I'm not sure about that. So we're going to undo that. I'm going to highlight this line of code and then hit Command Shift down to put it back into here. All right, and so that's the the compiler recognizes that I've done a null check already, and so I don't have to put that extraneous syntax in there. All right, so once we have that return person, I'm simply just going to log that out to the screen by doing log.d for debug, putting in something for our tag, and then finally our return person toString that we get built in to our function or data class. And then I'm also going to let us know that we've canceled. Before we run and test our application, I realized that our else statement inside here is actually inside our null check. And so when we go to check to see if this is null, when we pass back well, from cancel, you can see that it's canceled. We don't pass back an intent, so that data is going to be null. So I first have to move it out, and I'm just gonna cut it out of here, put it in an else here, and we'll just do one more check just to be verbose. So if the result code is equal to result canceled, and we're going to say user cancel. So that's a little bit redundant. Usually if we fall into this, the data could be null, but the result could still be successful. So probably a better option would be to put it into this here, highlight that, hit tab on that, and then of course let's shift tab, and that way I can get rid of this else statement. So you can do it either way. I just prefer to make sure that if the result is okay, I do something with the data. If the result is canceled, I don't need to do anything with the data, including checking if it's null. But of course, if you cancel and you still want to pass back data, you can do that as well. Your logic will just look a little bit different. All right, let's go ahead and debug this application. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to put a breakpoint here just to make sure that we're falling into that code. And it looks like we have an error, which probably means I have one too many curly braces. And our compiler let us know that we have a missing beginning curly brace. All right, let's try that again. All right, here's our application. We're just going to type it in here. Hit display. When we hit cancel, it goes into our onActivityResult. And then as we step through our lines of code, it's going to be result okay is not true. So it's going to drop down to this else if, and it should drop in here. And indeed, our user has canceled. So let's go ahead and hit the play button, go back to our application, hit display again to open up that second activity. Now I'm going to hit save. All right, so if you remember, I put a breakpoint in our save button on click listener. It's going to create a new object for us, create the intent. It's going to pass back these pieces of information, set the result to okay, return that intent. So if you hit the play button on this or the continue, we again drop into our onActivityResult. And because this now is okay, and the funny thing is, okay is equal to -1 in this case. So this should drop down here. Data, as you can see from our debugger, is equal to something. It's not null, so it should drop down into that. And then from data, we're going to try to get that serializable extra, which we did. And then if you look at the return person here, you can expand it and look at all the information. And indeed, this is the information that came from our second activity. And we're just going to print that out to the screen and continue. And we're going to double check that in the logcat. I do have our EA filter here for our tag, and you can see the user cancel. That's the first one, and then the second one that we did was the printing out statement here. So first name has been changed, last name too. Again, that came from our second activity. So that's one way of passing back data from our second activity to our first activity. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up and see more content of this type. And also subscribe to the channel if you want to see other videos on iOS development, more Android development, 3D game development, and much, much more. Share with a friend if you think it'll be useful, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.